All right, so we're going to get started. Welcome to Untold Stories. This program is meant to give you behind the scenes perspective, look at our new Creating Community tour. Uh, we are now on the other end of creating this tour, and so we wanted to share a bunch of the insights that we've gained along the way, make you a little bit more familiar with the topic and some of the highlights of what we're talking about. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. If you have a question that comes up that you're thinking about during the program, feel free to put that in the chat, and we will move through. So my name is Katie Burton. I'm the Director of Education and Interpretation at Curator Museum. And I'm here with my colleague, Catherine. Catherine, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Prescott. I'm the chief curator at, uh, at the museum and assistant museum director. So, yeah.
Excellent. All right, so let's get started. I will. All right, how does that look? Everyone can see? Okay, great. So, creating community is part of a much larger reinterpretation project that we've been working on for a few years now, where we've been reinterpreting the stories, the narratives, the site history at the Cannonball House. The Cannonball House is the name that the Gilbert family, who you'll hear more about in just a little bit, um, gave to our site. So this process of reinterpreting and rethinking how we tell our stories started with an NEH grant in 2021, National Endowment for the Humanities. Um, and I mention that all the time, but it was a really big deal. We're a small museum, and it was very exciting to get a national grant and to have a national platform for the kinds of work that we were going to try and do. And so during that first round of grant funding was when we created War at Home, which takes us beyond the cannonball to think more about the experience of the people who lived on our site during the Battle of Ridgefield. So we were really working with a lot of our some of the site history that we're most known for, most widely known for. And then we applied for and received a planning grant from Connecticut Humanities. They've been a big supporter of our work in a lot of different areas, but with these interpretation projects especially. And under that grant, we have been working on the next stage of our reinterpretation, and the tour that's come from that is Creating Community, which focuses on our early 20th century site history. And then just to give you a sneak peek, looking to the future, the next lineup we have for some tours and ideas for where we're going to go. Architecture and energy is going to be our next tour that we're going to debut to the public. We're working on that one right now, thinking about the hundreds of years of site history, and thinking about specifically how architecture has changed on our site over time, and how that's been done strategically to be energy efficient and comfortable. And then we also have a plan to get to to create a tour that's built around our 19th century site history. There's a lot of great material there, and we're just trying to stage it all out. When we applied for the grant, the NEH grant, even then we were focusing on America 250, which is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which will be in 2026, but we're really focusing and putting a lot of programming focused on that in the next year or so. But even back in 2021, we were thinking about it, and the National Endowment for the Humanities was thinking about it. And this was a big reason because of the site history that we have here that's relevant for the American Revolution. This was a big part of why they funded us. But I thought it was just helpful for you to see the language that the National Endowment for the Humanities used and the language that we use for our reinterpretation. We are thinking about themes of identity and memory. We're really thinking about and engaging with issues of race, gender, and privilege when we talk about our site history. We're trying to connect our site and our town and our country's evolution and think about through inclusivity and justice. So that's the language that we've been working with that's been framing our reinterpretive project for the past 4 years. It's also, as part of that reinterpretation, we've done a lot of assessment. We've created a new mission statement, new vision statement. We did board training. A lot of our current brand new strategic plan was informed by ideas that we were working with during this reinterpretation. And so I just bolded, you can find our mission statement and vision statement any day on our website, but I just bolded because you'll see these words come up. I'm trying to show, I think it's important to see a big part of our reinterpretation is to try and make the stories that we're telling really cohesive so that when people are coming to our site, we really have an identity, a cohesive identity as a museum, even though we're talking about hundreds of years of history and focusing at different places at different times. So our programming, our school programs, our exhibits, our tours, our events are all wrapped up into these cohesive ideas about who we are and who we're striving to be. So an emphasis on ongoing learning and open dialogue. That dialogue you'll see come in for our tours. Connecting past and present and thinking about the future. Connecting our site history with our nation's history, and then engagement, curiosity, and critical thinking. And those are two, curiosity and critical thinking are skills that we are looking to grow in our audiences through a variety of different ways, including on our tours. All right, so we moved to the early 20th century for our site history because we felt like there was a lot there that had not yet been talked about. For those of you who are familiar with our site, you've likely heard of the Gilbert family. And part of what we wanted to do in this tour, the Gilberts are the people who owned the property in the early 20th century. Cass Gilbert was a famous architect. His efforts, his wife's efforts, Julia's efforts to preserve the site really contributed to why we get to have a museum today. But we wanted to frame this differently and think about the Gilberts as part of a cast of characters, but not the whole focus. And so when we were looking at this process, started with a lot of research. Part of what we were trying to do is what's happening, take the temperature of the nation and the town, what's happening, what's going on. And in the early 20th century, it was very clear to us that a big thing that was happening in Ridgefield that reflected larger national experiences were there were people trying to figure out what it meant to be American, coming from different places. And so this is our description of our tour, where we're talking about early 20th century as a time of exciting change, disruptive challenges, thinking about what it means to be a Ridgefielder and an American. And what we were able to isolate are these different communities that are coming together really for the first time during this period. Longtime Ridgefield residents, people who had been here for generations, immigrants who were coming mostly from Europe at the time, and in our town, particularly Italian immigrants. And then summer residents, wealthy New Yorkers who were coming to stay in Ridgefield for the summer to escape the heat, the congestion. And so these three groups are coming together in Ridgefield for the first time, and they are doing a lot of navigating and trying to think about whose priorities take precedence, how they work together to achieve goals for the town, where there's areas of potential conflict. We were able to bring this history to life because two of our collection strengths, that Catherine will talk about in just a little bit, but we have collection strengths in early 20th century textiles. And then we have Hartmann glass plates, 7,000 glass plate negatives that we are able to pull these incredible pictures from that speak to this really broad history of our site in our town. And so you'll see as we go through this presentation, most of the pictures that you'll see were taken by Joseph Hartmann, who was himself an immigrant, a German immigrant, and a person who photographed all different classes of people in Ridgefield throughout the period of time that we're looking at. So just to go back 1 second, you'll see in creating community, we talk about the people who lived and worked on our site. And this was a really important pivot, a narrative pivot for us, because most of the stories we've been telling on our site have been focused on the people who lived on our site. And we realized that there was a lot, especially in the early 20th century, there were a lot of people who were contributing to our site history, but weren't permanent residents there, weren't homeowners there. And so we wanted to shift the focus to be more inclusive and to think about the people who are living and working on our site. And so that's what really expanded the lens for us from Cass Gilbert and Julia Gilbert, who you see here, and allowed us to do some really exciting research to learn more about the other people who were living and working at the site. My background is in English, so I always like to think about when we're creating new tours, I really think about it as trying to construct an essay in some ways, a story that we're telling, right? So our setting that we've chosen for this tour is our site and the town in 1915, and then we jump ahead to 1926, and we'll talk about why that year in particular in a little bit. We have our cast of characters who I've already introduced, and we're thinking about what does it mean to be a member of the Ridgefield community in the early 20th century, different opportunities that different groups had. And here on the screen, this is the Italian-American Society. I'm not sure. This one is Political Club. The Italian-American Society in Ridgefield went through about 12 different iterations of titles for their club. So I can't tell which iteration this is here, but so these are some of the members of that club there. So these are all recent immigrants. These are all photographs from around 1915. In the upper right-hand corner is a store, a general store, right? Is that right, Catherine? That was run by and frequented by longtime Ridgefielders. And in the bottom right-hand corner, Catherine, help me out. Ballard?
Ballard, yeah.
This is the Ballard family. So these are folks who are representing our summer residents, wealthy summer residents. The other thing that we're really focused on, as I said before, place-based stories with national resonance. And this was something that was really interesting to us, and maybe I'll see if I can remember to come back to this a little bit later too. But one of the things that we found when we had Ridgefielders come and take creating community is that a lot of Ridgefielders were worried. They liked the tour, but they were worried that the town stories, the people who were coming from out of town, who are maybe like 40% of our visitors, they were worried that these stories were not going to be interesting to them, that they were going to be too town specific. We found just the opposite. When we started polling our visitors, we found that lots of people from out of town could connect with the themes and ideas and people and experiences that we were talking about. But it's been really interesting and important for us to think about telling the story of the specific place that we are, but also making sure that we're constantly connecting it back to the regional and national context that's happening for people. And these pictures here, this is a picture of our walled garden right after it was first built. And then on the left-hand side here, this is a picture of Main Street before it was paved, and we'll talk in a little bit about why the paving of Main Street is important for this story as well.
All right. So, as Katie said, one of the things that we have found to be a strength of ours is this place-based storytelling. And so we want to make sure that we have good spaces to have people connect to the place. And for the early 20th century period, we're very lucky in that the house has this extension that the Gilberts added after they purchased the property, where we can't tell other stories, really. This was built by the Gilberts, it was used by the Gilberts. That's really the only story we want where we can tell in those spaces. Traditionally, in the past, we've only ever used the dining room as interpretive space. The pantry, which you see on the right, was our museum gift shop, and then the Gilbert's kitchen, which you see on the left, was museum staff space. But we wanted to be able to recapture that. It wouldn't be a very exciting tour if we just had people in one room the entire time. So we wanted to be able to use more of this space. We wanted to also provide the people who we're telling the stories of their own space, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the people we've introduced, like Margaret Ross, who's the cook, and we wanted her to have her kitchen and her pantry. So we decided to try to restore these spaces to somewhat of how they might have looked in the early 20th century. However, we don't actually know what the Gilberts' kitchen would have looked like when they were using it, or their pantry, because they didn't photograph working spaces. We're very lucky to have photographs of the rest of the house when the Gilberts were in residence, but not these working spaces. So we had to use a couple of different ways to restore. Katie, go to the next slide. So we looked at old photographs, magazines that showed, what ideal kitchens were like, and then other historic houses that we're interpreting in the same period. So these photos are from a house in Missouri, I believe, from about that time. But we've used these as well as considering the needs of the space for the tour. And we also connected with some of the Gilbert great-grandchildren who visited and stayed at the house in the 1950s. They were very young, but we did try to get some memories from them to help guide us in how the space ended up looking. So Katie, you'll go to the next slide. And these are the after photos. And so things like we put the pantry, the doors back on the china cupboards, and that paint color is as close to the original as we could get. And we found that original paint color by scraping away old layers of paint and uncovering those doors from the basement, things like that. So there were some changes we could not restore, things like the 1950s sink in the kitchen. But we did our best to kind of evoke what these spaces would have looked like in around 1915. So next picture.
Like our clever ice box, right? That hides a modern day fridge.
Yeah. All right. So in addition to restoring spaces, we wanted to restore stories. And we wanted to restore the stories of some of the people who worked on our site, who have kind of gotten lost in time. And so the first thing we did, because we are lucky to have a lot of Gilbert papers, some personal papers as well, uh, was to check our archives. And I found in Julia Gilbert's diary um, one entry where she mentions some of her staff. So I just pulled out these two quotes from an entry where she's talking about um, an event she held for a young soldier heading off to fight in World War One. And she talks about how at this event, it was just my Scotch cook, the Irish waitress, the upstairs maid, and the two Italian gardeners um, were in attendance, along with the Constable Taylor, the drafted man, and Julia herself. Um, and then she goes on to name some of these staff. Um, so there we stood, Margaret and Lizzie, who's the Irish waitress, the maid, and Secondo and Attilio, who are the two Italian gardeners. So from there, we had some names, and now we could start building biographies of these people. And the first place to look for this kind of history is the census, and that's really where we looked. And so that is where I found out more about Margaret. Her full name is Margaret Ross. She's listed in the 1920 census in the household of Cass and Julia Gilbert in Manhattan. And she's listed as their cook. And early censuses are great because they provide you with a bunch of information, including things like if they were an immigrant, what year they immigrated to the country, where they were born, where their parents were born, things like that, and things you can use to then find other information. So just a little bit about Margaret. She was born in Greenock, Scotland, which is just outside of Glasgow, on November 9th in 1881. And her father is named James, and she also has a brother named William. And Greenock is an industrial city, and in the early 20th century was known for its shipbuilding. And this, on the right, upper right, you can see a photograph of tenements in Greenock, around number 9 Crescent Street, which is where a man named James Ross lived in 1904. And so it's possible that this was actually Margaret's home. We're not certain. There were many James Rosses in Greenock, but this is possibly one of them. Margaret immigrated to the United States, landing at Ellis Island on September 3rd, 1904, and she arrived on the SS Columbia. We have ship manifest. And as Margaret was a young woman traveling alone, she was a single woman, she was not actually allowed to enter the country until she could have a family member vouch for her. And so she was actually detained for one evening until the folks at Ellis Island could get in touch with her Aunt Mary, who also lived in New York. And so all of these records are in all these papers are in the records, and so we can sort of build out this picture of who Margaret is. By 1910, she's working as a cook for the Gilberts, and she continues to do so into the 1940s. So she really kind of becomes a fixture in the family. And she was described by the great grandaunt Julie Viator as she remembers Margaret as making plain food that her mother, so Julie's mother, liked. So we kind of assume that maybe the Gilberts liked her food if they kept her on for so many years. All right, so next slide. So the other Gilbert staff member we sort of focused in on was Secondo Servadio, who was one of the Italian gardeners that Julia mentioned in her diary. And he was born in Monteporzio in the province of Pesaro and Urbino. which is kind of the middle section of Italy on the East Coast. And he was born October 30th, 1894. And he immigrated to the United States April 14th, 1914, and he arrived on the SS France. So you can see a picture of the boat. And one of the things we found very interesting is when we looked at the passenger manifest for the ship, Secondo is uh, recorded as arriving with $25 in his pocket. Um, and this manifest also tells us that he was going to join his uncle, Guglielmo Zandri, who was living in Ridgefield, Connecticut at the time. So he was following family into to Ridgefield. And also on this manifest, I noticed there's actually quite a number of people who are continuing on to Ridgefield, all from different places, kind of around the same area, all headed to Ridgefield. Um, and so Secondo, we know, worked for the Gilberts as a gardener before and during World War One. He married in Ridgefield an Italian woman named Josephina or Josephine, and they had a son named Oliver who was born in 1926. By 1930, the family had moved to Greenwich to this house on Brookside Lane, which they owned. As far as we can tell, they owned this house, and Secondo lived there for the rest of his life. And he died in Greenwich in 1987, which kind of hits hard sometimes, realizing how recent this history is actually. Um, so next slide.
If I could just, these seem like small details, but these two people, Margaret and Secondo, had never before, our museum had never talked about them before. Their stories, not any details of their stories had been described all these years that we've been talking about the Gilberts. They were a little coda in Julia's diary, and Catherine is maybe not giving herself enough credit for the detective work that she did to assemble all of this and really flesh out the lives of two of these people who spent a lot of years at our site and contributed, right? Like Secondo was the first gardener in our walled garden. And Margaret was cooking food for decades every summer at the house. So this is, it seems small, I guess, but it's a really big deal to have these stories fleshed out in this way and to have them have their faces and their experiences now part of the stories that we tell.
All right. And I just want to finish both of their stories. You know, they arrived here as strangers, but they both kind of came to our site and they both became naturalized American citizens. So these are the declarations of intention to become a citizen. And Margaret is also applying for a passport so that she can travel back and forth to Scotland. And so you can see Margaret and Secondo both do become American citizens. Margaret in 1924 and Secondo in 1936.
All right. So Catherine's done this research. We assemble these stories. We're building out our cast of characters. We have the Gilberts. We have Secondo and Margaret. We also, to represent the longtime Ridgefielders, find out more about Samuel D. Keeler, who was not a direct descendant of our Keelers, our museum's Keelers, but distantly connected. One of the many, many, many Keelers that were longtime Ridgefielders by this point. And he was a really prominent merchant businessman involved in a lot of the government infrastructure goings on of Ridgefield. And so we have these characters, we're telling their stories, and we're trying to give people a sense of how their stories are representative of experiences in the town and also nationally. And so to do that, we're moving through these two restored spaces, which is, again, I'm just going to emphasize, the two spaces that Catherine talked about, we had never used in tours before. The public had never gotten to go through and see those spaces before. So another really incredible part of our site history that we were able to share more broadly. Like our volunteers always knew what a cool stove we had in the Gilbert kitchen, but the public never got to see it, right? And it's this showstopper. So very exciting to be able to bring people in. And so what we do in our process as we're building new tours, as we prototype, which means we try things out, we build a script and a set, the scene in the museum, what we think will work. But then we want to hear from people if things are really working or not. And so we brought in focus groups, people from different stakeholder groups that are connected to our museum. And then we also would do visitor surveys. So anytime members of the public came and took the tour, we would ask them to give us their thoughts, reflect back on the experience. And this picture here, we have John Bradley, who's one of our staff and interpreters, and he's here taking a group of some prominent Ridgefielders or Ridgefield associated folks through as part of our focus group. Jack Sanders is right here. And one of the things we were so excited about, because he knows more about Ridgefield's history than probably anyone. When we got to the end of the tour, he was like, I didn't know. There was I can't remember what it was. He was like, but I didn't know this. Oh, maybe it was like the Gilberts. He was like, I didn't know this about the Gilberts. And we're like, yes, we've done it. We've figured out some compelling stories to tell here. So as our visitors went through, there were themes that we could see emerging in their feedback. As I mentioned before, whether people knew Ridgefield or had never been to Ridgefield before, the stories resonated for them. So Ridgefield people would look at pictures like you see here, some of these Hartman pictures on the wall, and say, oh, I know where that's located, or I can recognize this person is connected to my family in this way, or something like that. But for people who've never been here before, the themes that we had built out, where we're talking about what it means to build a community, immigration, and different themes, those were resonating with people regardless of whether they knew the town or not. We got pretty universal feedback. People love primary source documents, right? So we would incorporate the photographs, the census documents, naturalization papers. People really maps and things like that. People were very comfortable with gaps. So Catherine mentioned before, we don't know if that is definitely where Margaret Ross grew up. We also don't know when Margaret died. That is still a mystery to us. We haven't found records about her death, or where she eventually ended up, if she's continued at the Gilberts for her entire life. And we don't know a lot about her. We don't have journals or diaries from her. We don't know a lot about her internal thinking or Secondo Servadio's personal ideas. And so we use historical context to try and ask questions and speculate and get our visitors to make connections and try and engage with the gaps that exist, like a real historian, to try and figure out what their experiences might have been like. And lots of people were willing to make past present connections. They would see something, we're talking about something that happened in 1915 or 1926, and people would volunteer, oh, this just happened in my town, or this is the same as my parents' experience, or things like that. Two themes in particular, more specific themes that came up. Immigration narratives are a big hit. A lot of people come and are really interested in the stories of immigration that we're telling. A lot of people want to share their own family's immigration stories, whether they themselves are an immigrant, whether it's their parents, their grandparents, whether these are stories they know personally or stories that have been passed down. But we get to hear, and does feel like a privilege. We get to hear so much about how people and their families came to America or came to be American. And then another theme that comes up, and if you haven't taken the tour already, you definitely should come take the tour. We're not going to give away all the details. But one of the things that we do talk about is we don't have a sense of how or if Margaret was involved or connected to people outside of the Gilbert household during her decades of work with them. We do know that during the period that she's serving in this domestic capacity, that there are a lot of sociologists who are doing research into the experience of domestic workers, women, and that they're calling what these women are experiencing like an epidemic of loneliness and a life of loneliness. We have this quote up on our wall next to Margaret's story. Because these women are living in a family, but are not of the family. And this is really liminal position. The job takes up so much of their time that they don't have time to make connections outside of work. And so lots of women at this time are reporting feeling lonely. And so we don't know if Margaret was lonely or not, but we posed the question to our audience, our visitors, and a lot of people like to think about that, right? Like some people are bringing their personal experiences and they're like, no, I mean, she stayed with the family for 40 years. There had to be meaningful connection. Some people are saying, well, like I've worked a service position and it is really lonely. We know that there is, especially in the wake of the pandemic nationally, a lot of conversations happening about loneliness. And so we've found our visitors are really eager to engage with that theme. It's resonating for them.
All right. So, talk a little bit about some of the things that have really worked on the tour that people have connected with. The first thing is a lot of our archival material. As Katie said, people are connecting with the photographs, both people from Ridgefield and those from outside of Ridgefield. And I think one of the great things about these Hartman photographs and the fact that we can use them in this tour is photographs, people connect to photographs differently than like paintings. This kind of moment in time realness about a photograph really has people connect to it differently than, say, the portrait paintings we have of Anna and Abijah Rezegui. And for the Keelers, we have no depiction of them. And so, uh, there's physicality to the people in the photographs. And so we found people really love it. And if we let them, they would spend, the entire 45 minutes, I think, probably looking at all the different pictures that we've put up. Um, the next slide.
That's a true thing, right, Catherine? The kitchen, which is where these pictures are, and one of our first stops, we kept getting stuck there with the groups. We kept we realized we were spending 20, 25 minutes in these conversations looking at photos. We're like, we gotta figure out how to get them to the next room.
All right. So another thing also that happens to be in the kitchen that really worked is this map of Ridgefield because so this is a map of Ridgefield in 1912, and we've colored it with our three different groups because we've noticed that they kind of tended to congregate in certain areas. And so through the tour, we kind of reveal the layers one by one through different versions of the map. So this is the final one with all three. So you have the blue, which is the longtime Ridgefield residents. So you see right on Main Street and Katuna where the businesses are. And then you have some residences down Branchville Road. And then we add the summer residents who are in the yellow. And so, of course, we include our property, the Cannonball House, High Ridge Road, and some of the big estates kind of on the outside side of town. And then finally, we show where the immigrant communities were congregating. And they were over down in Branchville along the railroad. A lot of these Italian immigrants were coming up on the railroad from New York. And also, there was a lot of settling along what is now Bailey Avenue in the tenements that were in that area. And one of the things we talk about is kind of why these settlement patterns happen. Why do we see the red congregated along the railroad and not in other areas? And we found that the map actually resonates with both locals and people from out of town. People from Ridgefield, kind of know the area, but it's helpful to see it kind of in a top down. And then it also just helps orient people who may not be as familiar with the town. Next slide. And then the last kind of part I wanted to touch on is where the end of the tour, we jump ahead from 1915 to 1926, which is where the three groups that we talked about throughout the tour kind of come together in this one issue that kind of gripped the town in 1926, which was the paving and widening of Main Street. So in our archives, we have a copy of this letter that Cass Gilbert wrote to yet another Keeler, William Keeler, who was a representative of the town and a lawyer in town. And Cass is writing regarding the potential paving of Main Street and how he is very much against this. So Katie, if you want to go to the next slide. And so we present this letter and kind of talk with the visitors about how the different groups kind of would have thought about this particular issue. We have Cass's thoughts in black and white right there, but we also talk about how the business owners, longtime Ridgefielders, many of them were in favor of it. It would be good for business and transportation. And then we also discussed, the immigrants. They didn't really have a platform or the power to voice their opinion. We don't know what they said. There was nothing printed in the newspaper, but we can kind of speculate, engage with that gap, and think about what they might have thought of about it. We know a lot of these Italian workers in town were commuting by bicycle. If you've ever biked on a dirt road after the rain, it's not a pleasant experience. So we can so people really resonate with that and really like to kind of think about how all these different groups thought about this particular issue.
Yeah, and this was actually a moment we got from one of our focus groups, because we had been talking about the commute and how that would have influenced people's opinions. And then one of our focus groups, somebody was like, well, think about, for Margaret Ross, think about the dust. Think about the summer and how dusty the road was, and the dust would have gotten, and she's going to be trying to keep her kitchen clean. And maybe she's even having to be responsible for cleaning up when people are tracking in mud or the dust getting in through the windows. And so it was just another, we were able to add that, like, oh, that's a really great point. Let's add that to as we speculate and think about and try and construct some ideas, use curiosity and empathy and critical thinking to try and pull together some likely scenarios of how people would have been feeling at the
time. Yeah, so these are just kind of some of the discussion points that kind of come up. How would you have voted if you had the opportunity in 1926 on this issue? Or what's your road paving issue of today? Things like that. So those are kind of the discussion topics that really come up around this letter.
Other things that worked, quotations on the walls. When we had first person narrative, we could share that, right? We have things that Julia Gilbert and Cass Gilbert have said. We have something that S.D. Keeler said, because at one point in his career, there was a fire, his grain elevator burned down, and so he published an ad that the ad is just his first person voice saying like, "Don't worry, I've got you. Don't worry, I'm still reliable as a businessman." And so these quotations are really helpful at giving voice to people, giving people a sense of what our different characters are really thinking. Um, this is the kitchen, so where people are discussing the map, and have just looked at some of the photos. So this, instead of just having people tour standing up in the house, we're having them sit down in the kitchen around a table and talk together. And so we found that that's been really successful. People really want to spend time thinking about, well, what does community mean to me? What might it have meant for the different people? Why are people living in different areas? Things like that. Another thing that really worked for us was complicating the narratives of the homeowners, right? That we've had a lot of Cass and Julia's Gilbert-centric stories. And part of what we were able to do by sharing excerpts from their diaries and letters was to show them in a more fuller complexity. And so we know that Cass was an accomplished architect, also somebody who really was opposed to the road paving for a variety of reasons, and really wanted to impose his position even on other residents in the town. We know that Julia was a philanthropist, somebody who was really invested in trying to support different causes. We also know that she was very comfortable and in her wealth and wanted to continue in her wealth and appreciated being able to have people who worked for her. And so this complicating the narratives, right, showing Cass and Gilbert in their kind of their fuller complexity, help make them more human rather than just these sort of abstract people who are on pedestals in our site history. It also, though, is tricky, right? Because there are also people who had heard about the Gilberts for a long time, who know about the Gilberts' positive contributions to our site and to our community. And so some of the first person narrative from those two that we shared was not as flattering. And that was tricky. That was hard for people to reconcile this new information with what they had already known about the family.
All right. So a couple of other things that didn't work that we kind of tweaked as we went through the prototyping phase. A lot of it was kind of visual things. So one of the first things with our map, we had this really great idea that we would have clear overlays that would fold over and we'd slowly reveal all these different colors. That extra large map just didn't work. It was so awkward and unwieldy. Putting it on a stand didn't really work because not everybody could see it, but it was too big for the table. And the acetate layers kept sticking to each other.
We
It
tried
was
to
just,
be fancy. We tried to
yeah,
do too much.
yeah. Another thing we noticed is that some of our mannequins had blue mannequin covers while others had white mannequin covers. And this was partly a holdover from a exhibit on wedding dresses I had done back in 2021, because the navy blue really shows off contrast with the white dresses. And both Margaret and um, a mannequin in the dining room that has one of Julia Gilbert's dresses on it, they're white dresses, they're white clothes. But it started to get a little bit confusing. The navy blue was a little bit too close to black. And I think because we were asking people to consider race and ethnicity, kind of it's at the forefront of their mind, and it started to become a little bit um, causing confusion or concern. And at the same time, there has been a lot of discussion in exhibit design communities about what are the appropriate colors to use for mannequins. And the general consensus is like a mid-tone gray. So what we ended up doing is recovering all the mannequins in a gray fabric. just so we eliminate that potential confusion. Um, and one of the other things is we had a lot of photos of pets because we kind of thought that they were fun, a fun addition. Um,
Charming.
but we got some feedback that there were a few too many dogs on the wall. So, um,
Look
and another
at
thing
this
that
guy.
I
Look at his
didn't
portrait.
another thing I didn't put up here was labels on the Hartman photographs.
Mm,
They
yeah.
just they seemed to be distracting people. Um, and so we ended up taking them down, and just having the plain photographs with kind of a sheet that if people were really curious about who was in each photo, they could look at that up. But, all right, next. And then one of the other things that we got a lot of feedback on is that the Gilbert Wing only tour, right? So just these 3 rooms of the Gilbert Wing was not really satisfying to visitors who were curious about the rest of the house. A lot of people come to our site wanting to see a historic house and were telling us that they were a little bit disappointed. They loved the tour, but they were a little bit disappointed that they didn't get to see the rest of the house. And so we added a walkthrough of the first floor that focused on showing the house as it is now as a museum, but also um, pointing out how the Gilberts lived in the house using these wonderful photographs by the Wirtz brothers, which were taken in 1916. So around the same time as we're talking about in the tour. Um,
Yes, and this is an ongoing navigation for us that we're so well known for our 18th century history. And like when you drive to our museum, you see a huge white colonial. So never mind that it has a 20th century edition, you see a building that makes you think you're going to learn about the 18th century. And so we're trying to think about it's a marketing challenge, it's a narrative challenge, but we're trying to think about how to um, um, better weave our 20th century site history, our more modern site history, into public narratives about what our museum does as well. And this was we were trying too hard to just have people focus on the 20th century, and we needed to walk that line a little bit and give them some of the space. And Cass did us a favor again by keeping his house like a museum in the
yeah.
1910s. So we could do that. And so we wanted to just end. So our tour, you'll get a better sense of the details and contents of the tour when you come to visit if you haven't already. We reopen in March for tours. But what happens when we build these tours is that we inevitably find there are different threads and themes that we don't have enough space on the tour to talk about. For instance, at some point we will have a Hartman animals only exhibit. Like this is important to me that we get those dog portraits up there. But there's other things that we are thinking about that are in development that have been directly inspired by the research and visitor response to our tour. So one of the things for me that's really exciting and important is aligning our school programs with creating community. Again, most of our students are coming to focus on colonial era and American Revolution when they come to our site for field trips. But we are in the process of creating a school program that focuses on the 20th century, our early 20th century site history. And you see here, this was a homeschool group, so that's why there's such a variety of ages here. But a homeschool group who came and took creating community tour and did some associated activities. So this is something that we're really looking to continue building out and start drawing audiences, schools to our site, not just for the 18th century history, but also all the way up through our early 20th century history. These are scenes from, we had a teacher professional development group English teachers from Wilton High School who came and took Creating Community. And the left, John is leading the tour and the discussion about the letter on our tented terrace here. And then we had a discussion afterwards about how we're thinking about our tour as a model for how to sort of diversify narratives. They're really interested in incorporating more racially diverse texts into their curriculum, their high school curriculum. And so it was this great framing for a conversation that we were able to have with them. And then this letter that Cass Gilbert writes, people respond really strongly. And one of the things that keeps coming up is his language sounds so modern, or like we've heard these ideas before. And this is particularly interesting in the current 2025 moment in Ridgefield, where there are a lot of conversations about affordable housing and development and navigating making sure that we have housing to satisfy the growing influx of people who are coming here, making sure that infrastructure works, and also wanting to hold on to the charm and character of the town, right? And so these excerpts are from Cass Gilbert's letter. He says he's talking about doesn't want the paving to happen, which I guess spoiler alert, but the road was paved. And in fact, none of the groups who were fighting about it actually had any say over whether the road would be paved or not. It was a state road, and the state said we're paving it, and it doesn't matter. But so Cass Gilbert is talking about, he's trying to say, like, I'm an architect. I know what I'm talking about. If we widen Main Street, it'll change its character. It's bad town planning. And then this one, particularly at the end, right, that traffic on this newly paved road might destroy the beautiful old Connecticut villages that have so much charm and attractiveness. And so this language is really resonating with visitors today. And we are going to do, in April, we'll have a public program where we're going to do a film screening of Fighting for Home, which was a documentary that Connecticut Public recently produced that talks about housing policy and the housing crisis in Connecticut, because affordable housing and housing shortages are not just a conversation in Ridgefield, they're a conversation across the state. And so we're going to be having a film screening and a panel moderated by a staff from Connecticut Fair Housing Center. We're going to bring in some local folks to react to, talk back with the film, and have a community conversation around it. And so this is a program that was directly inspired by the content of Creating Community and visitors' reactions to it.
Yeah, and then a couple of upcoming exhibits that are tied into Creating Community. With the America 250 commemorations and celebrations coming up in the next year, leading into 2026, we noticed that there were a lot of parallels, kind of socially, politically, even economically, between 1926 and 2026. And so that kind of incited some curiosity in me to look at how did Ridgefield and the United States commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So that'll be, that's an exhibit that's in the works, kind of looking at how we define being American and commemorating the Declaration and connecting to the Declaration 100 years apart. And then in this fall, where I'm also planning on an exhibit that will feature some more of the Gilbert's textiles that we have in our collection, in an exhibit tentatively called Orientalism in American Fashion in the Early 1900s. So the early 1900s was a time when America and England in particular were like very fascinated by Chinese motifs and Chinese fashion. triggered by a lot of different things, but also the political situation in China at the time. And the Gilberts actually ended up purchasing these two court robes from the last imperial dynasty that came out of the last imperial dynasty, the Qing dynasty. And they're in our collection. They're very lovely. And so these would be the centerpiece in this exhibit that's kind of looking at how American fashion kind of adopted these elements of imperial Chinese fashion and Chinese goods in the early 1900s.
Within a context of anti-Chinese immigration sentiment too,
Yeah.
right? So it's a really complicated moment. All right. Excellent. All right. So we've reached the end. So as I said, our tour is open. We reopen to the public on March 1st, and we'll have Creating Community in our daily rotation for tours. You can sign up online. But we'll stop sharing now. If anybody has any questions, we could take a couple of minutes. You could write in the chat, or you could just unmute and speak up if you'd like. And I see in the chat, Cheryl says she might be related to Margaret Ross. We should follow that thread. We should check up on that. That would be really cool.
Bridget, you should be able to unmute now.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I really appreciate it. This is Bridget Johnson. And first of all, I just want to thank Catherine and Katie. There's so much work that went into this exhibit. It was so clear that there was a lot of hours and effort and research done. So I just want to thank you, first of all, for putting that much work into it. My question is really about the tone of the tour. Eric and I took the tour. Eric and I have taken so many of our friends and guests through the Keeler Tavern so many times over the 15 years, 16 years we've lived in Ridgefield. And every time we did, our friends and our guests would leave with a sense of wonder and just like something, they learned something new and exciting from having gone through the tour. And we were always so proud of the fact that the Gilberts had acquired the Cannonball House and helped preserve it. And it's such an important part of our town. And so what surprised me a little bit when we went through this particular exhibit was sort of the tone. In that, for example, Katie, you just mentioned that the Gilberts were shown in an unflattering light, I think is the language you just used this evening in talking about the exhibit. And Margaret Roth, this assumption that she necessarily lived a lonely life. She had no diaries, if I remember correctly. And our country is built on this immigration. Usually we try to celebrate immigration stories that are successes. My ancestors were immigrants to this country. And in my mind, Margaret was an immigration success story. So my question really is, what surprised me is having gone through the tour, I left with this feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm not really sure I would want to bring people who are not familiar with Ridgefield, if they're coming to visit us. I wouldn't, I was reluctant to say I'd bring them back because I don't think they would leave feeling like, wow, this is really neat. And so I just would love to know a little bit more about how that tone, that direction was chosen as opposed to sort of a celebration of immigration.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that, Bridget. I hear what you're saying. And I think it's also helpful to hear, when you gave us this feedback before, so this has been something that we've been thinking about since your visit. But so helpful to hear how your experience too, right? Like when you said in the things that you've experienced in your life and the immigration stories that in your life and familiar with have been really positive and about success. I think there's a lot of different ways we could answer this, but one of the things, and I bring this back to some of the language that we used at the beginning, but history is complicated, and a lot of history organizations and museums are invested in trying to better demonstrate the complexity, and complexity in a lot of different ways, right? So bringing in multiple voices, acknowledging that there are different experiences. And so I think what's really been interesting for us on this tour is that we have people who come and they share really positive immigration stories, right? And for example, I mean, we don't know what Secondo Servadio thought. I find myself connecting with him because my background is Italian. And so like I feel like I would be friends with this guy. And I have to remind myself, I don't know him. I didn't know him at all. You know, he might have been a really bad guy. But if you check his sort of pathway, he immigrates to the United States with $25 in his pocket, and he ends up a Greenwich homeowner with a family. And, you know, so like that is a really positive narrative of immigration. Margaret, we don't have we don't know other than her time that she spends with the Gilberts. But I think to your point, what we try to do in the tour is give space for people to share and interpret and help us engage with some of those gaps based on their experience. So you've had a particular experience that helps you read the tour in a particular way. We also have had a lot of visitors who come through and find those that they don't have such positive immigrant stories, right? That they share with us times that their family members have been discriminated against, and that they appreciate that we're giving space for some of those things when we talk about that in the tour too. And so I think that's where that sort of dialogic component and the idea that we're gonna create the tour together with our visitors becomes really useful and important, because it allows us to move in those different directions. And for the Gilberts, I mean, we tried to be really careful to, those are their quotes. That's Julia Gilbert's quote about how she feels that life is not worth living without servants, right? And does it make her a bad person? No. Does it make her human? Yeah. You know, like I'm sure if we put things on the wall that showed me in my journal at my best and at my worst, that would also be a really complicated and accurate depiction of me too. So I think this tour really, because of that framework of thinking about inclusivity, is really trying to engage more with the complexities instead of necessarily just like a feel-good narrative. But thank you for your question.
Katie, this is probably one for you.
Yeah.
But Erica asked, do you plan to have any exhibits focused on children that would engage our younger population? I'm really trying my best to support Keeler Tavern in our elementary school field trips as a parent and native Ridgefielder.
Thank you. We appreciate your support. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to think about how and this is part of our reinterpretation, is to think about how kids experience our museum. And we've been doing a lot of focus on that with our tours and our school programs. Some of our exhibits in the past have had really particular threads that kids could follow. We have some exhibits that are very kid-friendly, like hands-on history. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one. So Catherine, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about because she's asking about exhibits in particular.
Yeah, sure. So in the fall, we have our annual hands-on history exhibit in the barn, and we cycle through a couple of different themes every year. We have one on agriculture and climate. This past 2024 was on textile making in the region, and this coming one in the fall is about community building. In the past, we focused more on the mid-19th century and what Main Street Ridgefield was like, and the different trades and things. And we really highlight our tool collection and allow visitors to get hands-on and try things out. That's the great thing about old tools, is they're designed to be used and abused. So they're really sturdy. So this coming one, we're going to shift a little bit more towards the colonial period, but really about community building. in the colonial era. So that's coming up, and that's really definitely geared to kids, young and old. We really encourage people to come and play in the exhibit.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Hopefully, if you haven't been to see the tour yet, we will see you soon. We always welcome feedback, so we love to hear what you think. And yeah, be sure to check out our website. We've got a bunch of really great programs coming up, some virtual, some in person, and we'll see you soon. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.